I'm here with Professor Michael Olivas. This is our guest speaker for today. Very, very pleased to have him. Professor Olivas is the author of this book, Perchance to Dream, which is a history of the DREAM Act and DACA, a very in-depth discussion. It's a great book. If you're interested in DACA, definitely read this. And I'm not aware, Professor Olivas, I've told you before, of any other book actually that's been published in the last 5-10 years like this. So thank you very much for being here. I'm excited for this discussion.
Thank you. I'm delighted to have a chance to do this. Even on a Saturday morning, there's no place I'd rather be right now.
Absolutely. I appreciate that. Taking your Saturday time too. Okay, so before we get into some substantive discussion about DACA and the DREAM Act, I would just like to ask you about your background. Where were you born? Where did you come up? And where were you educated?
Well, I grew up in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where I've retired now after teaching at the University of Houston Law School for almost 38 years. Before that, I worked for the League of United Latin American Citizens at Howard University, and I actually have an unusual kind of birth path that would mirror some of those of your students. Although both my parents were birthright U.S. citizens, they met in the military in Tokyo, Japan, and they married overseas, and so I was actually born in the U.S. Army Hospital in Tokyo, Japan. Because my parents were in the service, we moved several different times. So I have a brother, I'm the oldest of 10, and I have a brother born in Panama, 2 of them in Texas, which we consider a foreign nation, et cetera, until my father left the service and we returned to New Mexico, where I grew up. I spent 8 years studying to be a Catholic priest, 4 years in high school and 4 years in college. And then it turned out I was much better at afflicting the comfortable than I ever was at comforting the afflicted. So I left and went to graduate school at Ohio State, where I got my master's and PhD. And then I went to Georgetown Law School. I practiced for a short while and then joined the law faculty at the University of Houston in 1982. And I stayed there with several visiting professorships and activities. I was general counsel for the Association of American University Professors. And I taught in 3 large areas, all of which are very robust fields. The first was higher education law. So I study the law concerning universities. And one of my books is actually about, which I just happen to have a copy here. It's in fine bookstores everywhere. It is a 1,200-page book for people who want to teach higher education law. And I'm on the 5th edition of the book, working with 2 collaborators. And this is my last time on it because I've retired now. I also taught immigration law, including business immigration law. So that would be of interest not only to you, Professor, but also to your students. And then my third area is completely unrelated, although it intersects. It's entertainment law. And I have a radio show on NPR called The Law of Rock and Roll. And so every week it's carried in different stations. You can Google it. And last week I was concerned with entertainers who die without ever signing a will and what that does to their estate. So Prince, Aretha, many others have die without wills, which is very unusual because both of them were in court. She'd been sick until she died when she was in her 70s. You would have thought she would have had a will. They found 4 wills, but none of them have been accepted because they weren't handwritten or attested to. James Brown died, but his will, it turns out, because of immigration reasons, was contested. It took 15 years to resolve that. Turned out he was married to a woman who herself was bigamous. She was in a relationship with a guy from Pakistan who had 3 wives before he came to the U.S. He married her. He never consummated the marriage, but she was technically married to him under U.S. law. And she thought that was a null marriage, and so she never told James about this. And it caused an enormous amount of litigation because it turned out, for immigration reasons, it was not only a sham marriage, but the guy took the wedding license and absconded. So I thought, sure, whatever happened to him. But the point is that immigration shows its head in so many different ways, but because of the overlap between higher education law and immigration law, these dreamers and documented students have been my life for the last 10 or so years. I've been very fortunate, and I write about this in the book, where I started out writing residency requirements. And if your students attend public institutions, they know what out-of-state tuition means. Mm-hmm. Well, that you add to that residence and domicile and durational requirements and the like, and it becomes very complicated. And so I've both litigated those cases. I'm on the board of the Mexican American Legal Defense Fund, and that's our bread and butter. We do all kinds of litigation, including litigation on employment authorization for documented students. We've had about a dozen of those cases. I retired, and I'm cutting back on these, except that I'm trying to pick up the entertainment law piece, which was always a hobby, but now it's grown to such an interest. And every single day, I read at least a dozen trade press, journals. I get wonderful questions from practitioners such as yourself. And immigration, as you might imagine, Dylan going to Europe for a tour. He's going to have to deal with 20 different countries. He's going to have reciprocity, not only on vaccinations and public health, but crossing borders and playing one night in Germany, one night elsewhere. And that's going to mean, and you can reverse that, of course, for international, for others. Like if Paul McCartney wants to come here, or if one of the other big reggaeton South American artists wants to come to the United States, they've got to navigate immigration. And so this is an area that also combines all of these issues together. And if they play on a college campus, then I got the trifecta.
There you go.
Higher education law, immigration, and entertainment law.
Absolutely, they should consult you, especially at the college campus. You went into a bunch of topics that I want to unpack. Slowly. Just real quickly, going back to your personal background. First of all, I didn't catch what you got your PhD in, and then secondly, what was your first job in immigration law?
Well, in fact, when I left the seminary after 8 years, I ended up going to graduate school at Ohio State. So I'm in English, because I was going to join the faculty of the seminary, and I decided not to do that. But I still got my master's degree. And so my first book was on John Updike, the quintessential U.S. writer, and whose work I love. My dad used to say, why do you read this Updike guy? His life has nothing to do with yours. I said, well, the same reason I read Neruda, the same reason I read Shakespeare. I try, it helps me escape this small town of Santa Fe, New Mexico. And so that was my master's degree. But then they weren't hiring people in those days. The growth of colleges had been such that between 1964 and 1974, the United States opened up a new college every single week that were growing. And so they were hiring people, but there were no jobs left in English. They'd already done all the hiring. So I switched over because I loved universities. So I got my doctorate in higher education, which was a growing field at the time. And then I decided while I was going to do that, while I was doing that, to become a professor of higher education, to teach others how universities ran. And I had taken a higher ed law class. So I decided a lot of decisions were being made by lawyers, and I wanted to know what they were talking about. So I decided to go to law school. So believe it or not, now do what I say, not what I do. I walked in on a Saturday morning that was raining at Ohio State University without a ticket to take the LSAT. And I had never taken a practice. I'd never even seen one, which is not the way you should do it. But it turned out I was a pretty good tester, and I caught on. Someone didn't show up because of the rain, so they let me take this. I put my money down, took it, and did well enough to go to Georgetown Law School. And so I finished I defended my dissertation on a Friday, moved on a Saturday to DC. I started law school on a Monday, and I had class for 4 nights, for 4 years, for 5 nights a week plus Saturdays. Wow. That's why Saturdays are a work day for me. And then I worked for the League of United Latin American Citizens, which is the largest Latino organization. And I did that. And then that was my time in legal practice. And then I joined the faculty at the University of Houston, where I started up an institute to teach lawyers about college issues and to teach college administrators about legal issues. So I ran that for 38 years, and turned out there was no case book in the field anymore because the guy who had done it was on the federal bench, and he had stopped being a faculty member. So I wrote that case book, and then there were also no immigration case books. I just couldn't handle two. So some other colleagues had begun to do that. So at the time I began to teach, there were no case books, no textual materials, no readings. In fact, what I used to do was I had these old copies of I bought up through old bookstores and so forth, because we didn't have Amazon in those days. I bought up about a dozen copies, and I would give them to my students and collect them back and photocopy new cases to add. And eventually there were more Xeroxed pages than there were pages in the textbook. So in 1989, I published the first edition of my casebook, and we're now doing the 5th edition of that, as well as a teacher's manual. So that's how all that happened. And I just have to say, even though I'm usually extremely well prepared, I found it very difficult to be both a graduate student working at the same time and applying for law school. So I really do sympathize with students. And so when I came to the University of Houston, after about 5 years, I started a pre-law program that helped students who were juniors and seniors. You had to have at least 60 hours. And during the summer, I brought in colleagues. We had class for 3 weeks. They took sample LSATs, the opposite of what I did. I brought someone in from Princeton Review, and we got them reduced rates. So I would pay for a third. Let's say that it was, I'm just picking a number, $500. I'd pay a third out of some funds that I raised from law firms. Princeton Review would discount it by a third, and I wanted students to have skin in the game, so they paid a third.
Smart.
And they all improved their scores, and they took it seriously. And I also started bringing in admissions officers from various law schools. And so in the 13 years I ran that program, we had well over 200 students who were admitted into various law schools, both in the U.S. and abroad. So it was very successful because you were able to get students who were they weren't ready for law school, but they were ready to focus on what it took to go to law school. And that's what life is about.
Absolutely. If I could just interject real quickly, you mentioned do as I say, not as I do. For my students who are considering law school, you cannot anymore go in without a ticket to take the Lsat. Professor Olivas, exactly. Professor Olivas, different time. That was a different time. You can't do it anymore. So you cannot do that. And then when people ask me about law school, I always say you should study for the Lsat like it's a full-time job for a period of, I would say, bare minimum 2 to 3 months, and ideally even more if you can. So yes, I love hearing these stories. I took the Lsat around, I believe, 2008 or so. The idea of waltzing in without a ticket is just comical to me. So I love hearing about the stories from the veterans, you know?
I was undocumented even then.
Yeah, exactly. That is a form of undocumentation. Second quick question. Are you familiar with Professor Philip Schrag from Georgetown Law?
Okay. He's a very good friend. He was not one of my professors, but I know him. In fact, emailed him. He's got a son who writes in the area of higher ed law.
Oh, wow.
His son's an historian. He is a wonderful scholar, and he has trained many people who've gone into immigration teaching. And that's just one of his books. I did meet the young man that book is about, because he gave a talk one time and I happened to be in the audience. And
very nice. Very nice. This is one of our 2 assigned readings actually for this class. The other one being Understanding Immigration Law. So I had no idea that you knew Professor Schrag. That's cool. So Okay, great. So I appreciate that. That background really helps for students to have an idea of the different paths to law school and a career in immigration. I want to shift to the topic of your book here. So it says, the title is Perchance the Dream, A Legal and Political History of the DREAM Act and DACA. Now, my students know by now that the DREAM Act and DACA are not the same thing. These are two separate things. Right. The DREAM Act, of course, is kind of a colloquial term for a series of failed legislative efforts to basically provide a path to residency for those who are quote unquote dreamers. And then DACA, of course, is an act of prosecutorial discretion by President Obama almost 10 years ago. So they're two different topics, of course, related, absolutely. Professor Olivas, I'd like to talk about the DREAM Act first, if it's okay, because I consider that predates kind of DACA. And you have a very interesting discussion about the history of the DREAM Act. It's repeated commonly that kind of the first DREAM Act was introduced in 2001, but you write that the predecessor of that actually is like 2 decades beforehand, actually. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. I forget if your institution is a public or a private institution.
It's public. It's Nevada State College.
Yes. Okay. I knew it was in Nevada. That means that if your students are not residents of Nevada, they pay, people from Nevada pay X amount of tuition. People outside Nevada pay X plus. Right. And in Texas, when I started there looking into this issue, it was X was only $4. That's how long ago it was. But out of state or out of country was 10x. So whenever that 4 went up, so did the other exponentially. And I got my start in this area, and I write about this in the book, dealing with migrant students, not so much immigrant students. When I went to Ohio State, and the only reason I went to Ohio was because my bishop sent me to a seminary in Columbus. So when I left, Ohio State was there, and it was the path of least resistance, plus I was going to graduate school there. So, but I found all these farm workers who technically lived in Texas, except they belonged to the migrant stream. And so they would follow and pick the crop, their families would pick the crops all the way up to cherries at Michigan, and then they would return. So they weren't in school at the time, although every year their path they looked the same. So they'd spend 6 weeks in Brownsville or the Valley of Texas. Then they would move to Arkansas and start picking cucumbers. Then they would move up and pick the crops. And when they got, it says my internet is unstable. Well, okay, there we go. Okay. It's me who's unstable, not my internet. So by the time they got up to Ohio, they were picking tomatoes. And tomatoes were just then being modified and monetized. And they were making them uniform seed so that machines could pick them up. They also reduced the sugar, which meant they weren't as vulnerable. So they were losing the crop picking. And Campbell, everybody knows Campbell Soups. That's named after Campbell, Ohio, which is in northern Ohio. And so these kids started their parents wanted them to go to college, but they couldn't get into college because they, in a certain way, had Texas residents, although I'm not sure that Texas would have considered them residents because of their mobility. So I took upon my so I was trying to recruit these kids, and I could get them into Ohio State, but then when it came time for tuition, it was a different matter. And they were very unyielding on this because these kids, they thought were going to be marginal kids. The truth is, these kids were really good at STEM fields. They could calculate exactly how much mileage would go for a gallon of gas. They could repair farm machinery. They could do mechanical engineering, in other words. They knew geography because they were moving around. They knew social work because they, had to partake of benefits, et cetera. And they certainly knew employment because they worked in the field since they were little kids. They also knew agricultural pesticides. So for a variety of reasons, I was trying to recruit them to go to college. And their parents were for it. They just didn't know how to go about doing it. And it turns out many of them were Mexican Americans. Most of them were, virtually all. So it wasn't an issue of citizenship. So I worked out, I remember going to the Ohio Board of Regents. I showed them a film called Harvest of Shame, the 1960 classic film by Edward R. Murrow about how badly agricultural workers are treated. Of course, that could be 50 years later. That could be today because they're treated just as badly. But I showed it to them, and then I showed them a plan that would have allowed these students to aggregate 3 years into one. If they could total up 12 months in Ohio for over 3 consecutive years, they'd get in-state tuition. And they looked to, everybody sort of looked up because no one had ever challenged this. 12 months was common everywhere. And in fact, I was an out-of-state student at Ohio State because I grew up in New Mexico and I kept my voting and my address in New Mexico. And so I was an out-of-state student as well, so I had personal experience. They said, well, aren't people going to try and fake their way into being agricultural workers? So I said, well, that's not the, I can see people misrepresenting, but they almost always misrepresent up, but not misrepresent down.
Right.
So I happened to have some transcripts. I pulled them out and I showed them that these kids went, their high school transcripts showed the same 6 weeks, the same 6 weeks, the same 6. And they said, anybody that wants to fake this, we want them as a student because it has to be pretty good. So they got in. That was the very first time any state had broken the strict 12-month requirement. So I sort of filed that away in my head, and I began to recruit these kids, and it's still on the books, and other states began to adopt it. And because they had reciprocity arrangements, if they went to Michigan, they could also get Ohio residents, and so and vice versa. So it was my first foray into how residency, while you look at it, so it was introduction to legal reform, but also how to read carefully and how to understand what a law is getting at, which became very useful to me as an advocate over the years.
Right.
And so and I stayed friends with some of the people who were on the staff because they talked about it for years, how I'd come in and changed everybody's rules. And these guys were all opposed. They had taken a preliminary vote before I came in. They all said, no way. But we said he gets a hearing, and I changed it. It was unanimous, and the legislature changed it. So it was my first foray. And then I began to see, of course, how undocumented students were treated, because in 1982 with Plyler versus Doe, they were allowed to stay in school. In fact, even though Texas tried to charge them $1,000 tuition, which is more than college tuition, or not let them attend school at all, the Supreme Court in a 4-3 decision, very important, sort of the high water mark of immigrants' rights, they said that they were also required because the truancy laws had never been changed. So you had this inconsistency where the overall law required them to be in school, or their parents could be in trouble, but they weren't allowing them to be. And this case, when I was in law school at Georgetown, I remember some MolDef lawyers coming to DC for a fundraiser. So I cut class, which I don't urge your students to do unless it's for an important cause. And I met the people, and I was later asked to be on the board. And so I wrote a book called No Undocumented Child Left Behind about Plyler, which is now celebrating its 40th anniversary. And you couldn't have undocumented college students without Plyler because these kids were allowed to stay in school. And the only question was whether or not they lived in the district. So it also was about residency and about duration. And of course, these issues surface today. There's a lot of states, particularly red states, that make it very difficult for college students to register to vote because they say you're only living here part of the year, and then you go back home during the summer and Christmas where your parents live, and that's where your domicile is. So I began to learn how to slice these things up. And any kind of right has lots of dimensions. You hold it up to the light and you look at it differently. It's like a kaleidoscope. And you can, and I saw my way through, which was duration. And the Supreme Court opinion made it possible. And so there began to be dozens of cases, mostly in California, because that's the largest state with a large agricultural and immigrant population. And they got residency. They got it at the 2-year college system. They didn't get it at the higher level, the Cal States or the University of California. That came eventually, and it came about with a case down the road in which I was involved. But I helped write 6 different state statutes to give in-state tuition, including Texas, the very first one. And you may remember when the man who took over Governor Bush's place when Bush was elected, sort of elected, then Governor Perry became governor for a long time. And I worked with his staff to write the very first in-state tuition, which allowed students who'd been there 3 years, based on my experience in Ohio.
Mm-hmm.
But some of his staff said, well, how about 10 years? Because otherwise they'll be crossing the border just to come to college. And I said, well, that's not the way this works. They come over with their parents who seek work, who are being hired by U.S. companies,
right.
or there would be no undocumented immigration.
Right.
And up until 1986, with the Immigration Reform and Control Act, employers weren't ever sanctioned; they weren't ever punished for it. Mm-hmm. It all fell on the immigrants.
Right.
So I said, well, in Texas, public high schools are sophomore, junior, senior year. That's 3 years. How about doing that? So they said, okay. So every state now that has one of these, except New Mexico, which only requires 12 months, no matter how many years you are, people who are undocumented, and I'm not talking about DACA, that brings in separate kinds of issues. Most DACA students are able to get in-state tuition mm-hmm. because of other features to it that I'll talk about in a moment. But for the most part, it takes 3 years. So if you move from Texas to New Mexico, let's say Texas to Oklahoma. Now, Oklahoma has a law, and they allow you to get in-state tuition. Mm-hmm. And if you went for 3 years, consecutive years. And so these kids, so I call it going to college, because all of a sudden all these undocumented kids who are almost always at the top of their class because mm-hmm. they've got this immigrant striving, their parents, mm-hmm. they know their parents came here and sacrificed, and the family lives in the shadows mm-hmm. because they want their children to have a better life. And so the kids are imbued with this kind of spirit, the same way you are when you're a family from India and you come here. You know your parents moved here, mm-hmm. not because the basmati rice is great, but because it is a good place for immigrants, right. On balance. And so now over 30 states have in-state tuition, and even unlikely states have it. I'm always surprised. Nebraska has it, for example. Wow. Well, there must be like 25 undocumented students, because once you're documented, you're no longer undocumented. That's right. So you mentioned that earlier, the difference between Dreamers and DACA students. You also have to add to that those who are completely undocumented. For example, right. They're too old to be eligible for DACA. Right. Or now they're eligible for DACA, but because it's been frozen, they can't get in anymore. Right. So those folks are actually really on the outside. They're like under a bridge in Brownsville. Right. With very few options, but they still have this other option of in-state tuition. Mm-hmm. And in some states like Texas and in California, you can get loans, you can get various college grants and so forth. Mm-hmm. So even in conservative states, this happened because it's better having kids who might someday become citizens if they could find a pathway, which of course is what many of your students need. It won't be like this forever. Mm-hmm. And that, if we were to flash forward in 2012, a group of law professors wrote the Obama administration and urged them to use prosecutorial discretion. And one of the group was a woman who I work with a lot, Professor Shobha Wadia at Penn State. Right. And she had written a book, her first book, on prosecutorial discretion. And interestingly, here it intersects with my own life, because the very first case of prosecutorial discretion that she used to make her points about how broadly the concept can work is the John Lennon case. Now, many of your kids don't know that John Lennon is one of the great singers. He was shot dead in New York. And if you just look him up, believe me, he was one of the best. And he died way too young. In fact, we just celebrated 50 years of celebrated is wrong, more than 50 years. But in any event, people ask me sometimes, was Paul McCartney ever in a band before anything else?
Yeah, you may have heard of him before.
Yeah, look him up, you'll find him. So he had married a woman named Yoko Ono, whose ex-husband had absconded with their daughter. So they wanted to stay in the United States to look for her daughter. And eventually they found him in Texas, and the case was tried in Houston, of all places.
Wow.
So John Lennon wants to stay, but he has a drug bust from years before. I mean, it was almost required that you have drugs in rock and roll in those days. Not that that's changed all that much. Pot's legal now. But President Nixon also was afraid of him, that he would mobilize youth to vote for the Democrats instead of for him. So he tried to have him removed. And he contested this, saying that this was a very low grade. There was a humanitarian purpose. And could they please use the discretion available to them? And what he meant was any police force, any authority has to prioritize its interests. And going after nonviolent people who didn't have felonies, it was a misdemeanor, not a felony under U.S. law, should be a very low priority. So instead of going after jaywalkers, you go after
murderers,
drunk drivers, or someone, they're always going after murderers, but and sometimes actually going after, in a busy street, traffic, going after jaywalkers is a pretty good thing, because it shows people that you're serious even about small crimes like that. But in any event, what they wanted to do is to find the rules that were on the books that were never made public, like what his lawyer called the private law, secret law. And he wins the case.
Wow. John
Lennon wins his case in that first case, which his lawyer wrote a book about, and they even made a documentary. So if you look up documentary John Lennon versus U.S., it's a great case, and it shows that not only is prosecutorial discretion legal, it's essential, because otherwise you'll be bogged down in all these little jaywalking busts, and it'll freeze you up and require more policing than if you don't. If someone does it right in front of you, or if they're doing it in a way that draws attention, or if it causes an accident, well, then it rises, but then it's because it's more important. So this notion of prosecutorial discretion is deeply embedded in enforcement everywhere. Right. Just like it is this weekend, I'm going to study history on Saturday, I'm going to do my math homework on a Sunday. All of us set time and mission together, and we do it every day. Just we don't think of it as a way of life, but it is, especially a successful way of life. So this has been on the book. So President Obama made a proposal that some people erroneously have called an executive order. It wasn't an executive order. That would have been more formality. It was executive discretion. And he said, we're simply not going to enforce these. And in fact, we're going to suspend their deportability. So he puts forward this program. And at first I thought, in fact, I'm embarrassed to say, I wrote saying this is not a good deal, because you're giving the government all this information, and it was all discretion. They didn't have to give you employment authorization. No one knew they were going to give you a social security number, or they were going to give you lawful presence, because it was unclear, and it rolled out. You got all these wonderful things. So I immediately took it back and tried to burn all the copies I had written earlier. But I learned my lesson, and it turned out that you get three things that are sacrosanct. The first is permission to remain in the United States, right? Where if they do try, so your deportability is frozen. So all of you documented folks out there know this. Now, if you break the law, or if it turned out you materially misrepresented and used your cousin Jose's name instead of yours, that's a material misrepresentation. You never had it, and you can be deported. Right. But in all the years that DACA has been around, by my count, and I really follow this stuff, I can find fewer than 24 DACA members, documented students, who were ever removed from status. It's because they did things like they got drunk, or made some other kind of crime that knocked them out. Right. But you got three things, and I say this even though Catholics believe everything comes in threes. This is what you get: three things. You get lawful presence. You don't get lawful status. Right. But you get lawful presence, which means you can't be removed without due process. You can't just take you to the border and dump you.
The other, if I could pause real quickly,
Sure.
Professor, just for my students, the other big benefit of lawful presence is that if you receive DACA before your 18th birthday, and then you keep it all the way through, you will never have accrued unlawful presence, which can be a bar to certain immigration benefits down the path. This is a very complicated subject, obviously, but that's another huge benefit, especially for those who get on the DACA train before they're 18.
It is, in fact, one of the, what's been called, if you're a Republican, you call it a loophole. If you're a Democrat, you call it completely reasonable, and how else could it be otherwise?
Right.
It's one of the pathways to citizenship. Now, unfortunately, a lot of the 800,000 didn't have, didn't meet those age qualifications. That is, they were older, they already had it. But still, it's an important consideration. I figure all those kids have already used that in all likelihood. I don't think there are any more sort of unused ones who did it. But there could be, and I would make an estoppel argument. I know you're not law students, so I'm not going to go into it in great detail. Mm-hmm. The second thing, of course, and what to many of these kids was the most important, is you get EAD, employment authorization documents, mm-hmm. work permits. Mm-hmm. That is a very big deal. And I will say that it has worked phenomenally well, even though MALDEF, the board in which I serve, has had about a dozen cases, because there's still some employers that you have to just beat over the head. And here's my mantra: employment authorization is employment authorization is employment authorization. Mm-hmm. You have it until you don't have it. Mm-hmm. The only way you don't have it anymore is if you don't renew timely, which you're still allowed to do, or if you do something that you're no longer eligible for DACA. Right. And again, that just doesn't happen very often. When it does, it's almost always because someone left the country and then didn't have permission to come back in. Mm-hmm. They didn't get advanced parole, which is one of the other side benefits. Mm-hmm. The third thing is you get Social Security number, so you get participation in public benefits. Right. And it turns out that having a Social Security number will, and a law degree and all the other details, will allow you to practice law in 6 states. Yep. Even if you're undocumented, even if you don't have legal status. Yep. Who knew? So one of my chapters is on just on that. I did a national study on licensing, and also several states have made changes. In Florida, for example, they changed the law that if you have DACA, you become and you're otherwise eligible, you can become a lawyer, licensed lawyer. Mm-hmm. In California, if you're undocumented, mm-hmm. you can become a lawyer. Right. Because there was someone who was too old for DACA, Sergio Garcia, not the golfer Sergio Garcia, but the lawyer Sergio Garcia, and the Supreme Court in California finally decided, because the law was changed, it made a special law for him, and he was otherwise eligible. He'd become eligible, he passed the bar and everything else, but the question was whether or not he could meet the domiciliary requirement of living in California. And they said, after the law was changed, now you can. So, in New York, did it administratively, and you would have to. This is down the road for you guys, but don't let it be an impediment. There are people out there working for you who have your interests, and the law has changed in large part because you have this big cohort of 800,000 DACA students who are wonderful. They all speak English. They're at the top of their classes. They're making their way. Some of them are now doctors and lawyers, mm-hmm. Not Indian chiefs, but everything else. And it is an amazing group of students. And so flash forward. In comes the Trump administration, and they want to undo this, and they just decide to stop it. They don't announce it. Mm-hmm. Now, it's one thing to announce it and start a program. It's another to just announce it and stop a program. Mm-hmm. So this case goes to the U.S. Supreme Court. First, on the constitutionality, there's a case that goes to the Supreme Court. It's a 4-4 tie, and I write about that in the book. Mm-hmm. But because it was a 4-4 tie, and then got frozen for a while, I'm going to set that aside. The big case is the case that came after that was decided in 2020. That said the Trump administration didn't properly shut this down, which requires mm-hmm. notice and comment. Mm-hmm. That you tell everybody in the world, especially interested parties, what you're going to do. They have a chance to write in about it, and then they make their decision based on those findings. Right. They didn't do that, and it's so crazy because every one of my students in Law 101 knows you got to do that.
Mhm.
I think if you came here from Colombia, you know that because you gotta follow the law to shut stuff down, and they didn't do it, and they also misrepresented why they were doing it, and they got caught. So that allows DACA to continue. And while it doesn't, all it meant was if the Trump administration had had time and done so, they could have had notice and comment, a shortened process, and probably shut it down. Now, they did as much as shut it down because they didn't allow any new ones. They allowed it to be 1 year instead of 2, which doubles, of course, the price, the fees, and so forth. And of course, this sword of Damocles is hanging over your heads, and I understand you know that, and so I'm not going to commiserate with you about something that's your life experience. The Obama administration had also tried to enact DAPA, which was a program to allow parents who are undocumented who have permanent resident or citizen children, because sometimes, like if you're born in the United States, then you're a U.S. citizen, even if your parents are, and you can't do anything about. You can't turn around and help your parents until you're 21.
Right. So
I've always thought, boy, these kids are clever. They arranged to be born in the U.S. and then 21 years later, they can help their parents become citizens. Well, we need more people who are that smart. These kids are so smart.
Professor, sorry to interrupt. If I could you're giving us so much great information. I just want to unpack a few of the things you said to make sure that they're in digestible chunks for the students. So a couple things. So obviously, first of all, we're talking about DACA, right? So we jumped from discussing legislation related to in-state tuition, and now we're talking about 2012 and the basically implementation of DACA. You mentioned prosecutorial discretion, right? So in general, right, we can say that that's the concept that agencies that have to prosecute, and we're using prosecute in the broad term here. We don't mean put somebody in jail necessarily. Right. We mean to enforce the laws when we say prosecute.
To punish someone.
Exactly. So as a prosecutorial discretion in general is the idea that these agencies that have to enforce the law have limited resources. They cannot go after everybody that they're perceiving to have every tiny violation of the law. So they have to prioritize the use of their resources. So the idea was that these people who qualified for DACA, it ended up being about 800,000 in total. These are people who are the lowest priority for the enforcement of some immigration laws, which is because they were brought to the United States when they were children, very young. So they didn't really have much volition in coming. Number two, they have not committed any felonies. They have not committed any significant misdemeanors. They have not committed 3 or more non-significant misdemeanors. And then, of course, there's educational requirements. And those are all requirements to have gotten DACA. So the idea was that we're going to let these people stay, and as you mentioned, give them protection from deportation. Okay, so that's one big thing. And then the other thing that I just want to unpack that you mentioned, you kind of went over quickly, and I want to make sure that my students get this. Why is it that somebody who's born here can only help their parent after the age of 21? Okay, and that's because that's the age at which you can petition for a family member. Okay, that's a parent. Okay, so that
or brother
or brother, true, exactly, or brother. So my students know about the I-130 petition for alien relative. That's the first step for bringing a family member over, or if they're here, basically getting a family member on the path to residency. Okay, that petition just establishes the relationship and the basis for a potential green card. You can't, by our immigration law, you cannot file that until you turn 21. So that's what the professor was referring to when he said, once the kids that are born here turn 21, they can maybe in some circumstances turn around and petition for their undocumented parents. Now, the problem is, and I'm sure you're going to discuss this, Professor, the problem is, while there may be a path, a basis, a green card available for those undocumented parents, they have other challenges as a result of previous immigration violations that make them inadmissible, removable, et cetera, et cetera. Right. Thank you, Professor. Go ahead. I just want to clarify those points.
I'm glad that you did. I assumed, because these DACA kids know more immigration than you and I do at the street level, that they knew that. The big problem, of course, is that many of these students, if you're from Germany or something, there's not a long line, but these are in a queue.
Correct.
And right last I looked, it's called fourth preference for brothers and sisters, for siblings. if you're from the Philippines, as a lot of undocumented people are, there's like a 19-year wait.
Right.
And that means, by the way, they won't let you bring your brothers and sisters here even as a visitor because they're afraid those kids will abscond.
Right.
So, and I said earlier, I'm the oldest of 10, so there's 5 boys and 5 girls. I love my brothers and sisters, but not enough to keep them on a list in good graces for 19 years. If you're a permanent resident of the United States and you're married to a Mexican national and want to bring her in or him in, there's like a 6-year wait. These are for people who are married and who are eligible for who have permanent residence.
Right.
So the overriding family principles, both, I'm going to set aside business for the moment, but let's just talk about family reunification. It's a very high priority on paper, but there are oversubscribed nations that many of your students, especially the Mexicans, are on, and there are about 8 that are, China, India, Dominican Republic, etc., leaving Mexico. There are long lines, and you got to wait your turn. So many of the restrictions is say, well, my grandmother came in from Russia, and she had to wait in line and go through Ellis Island, and so there were no numerical quotas in those days,
right.
And there were an awful lot of undocumented Russians who came here, and they just sort of blended in, and eventually, But with regard to Mexicans in particular, my own community, my people originally from Zacatecas,
nice.
It is like about half of New Mexico, because my grandfather said he didn't cross the borders crossed him. But you wait in line, and you've got to keep your nose clean that whole time, and if your father gets caught speeding or jaywalking or something, it turns out he's undocumented, he's going to be repatriated. Right. He's going to be deported, and with very little due process. And because you're living with him, chances are you'll be deported. In fact, every year, tens of thousands of U.S.-born, U.S. citizen children whose parents are undocumented are removed from the country. Now, you can represent yourself at the age of 18, but by then, the best, most recent years of your young life have been somewhere else that you don't consider home. You probably don't speak that language any longer, and they consider you pocho. If you've got relatives in Mexico and you've left, they all think, that the derogatory term is either agringado, you become a gringo, or you're a pocho, and that's not, or a bolillo, a white roll. So it's like a sellout if your family left. Of course, they all harbor the hope of coming up here anyway. But the point is that there are many different requirements. It's not just straightforward, and especially once you start out undocumented, there has to be numbers available for you. There have to be opportunities.
Right.
There's this brief space. If you leave the country with permission under a program called advanced parole, and you return, in that moment, you can have it waived if it turned out you didn't have any felonies, etc., if you're otherwise eligible. And so some students have taken advantage of that, but you have to know in advance, and it really puts you under the gun. The most is, as Professor mentioned, if you were not 18 when you did this. It's just that most of the kids, in my experience, were 18. I've only met about half a dozen in all my years of doing this, and of course I lived in Houston, which is like ground zero for the undocumented. I only met a few who were so young. We had the first DACA clinic at the University of Houston. And so I've dealt with a lot of these students over the years, and this is why I've dedicated my life to you guys, because I admire you. In 1 year, 12 of the high school valedictorians in the Houston School District, which is the 4th largest school district in the country, over 200,000 students, they were undocumented. Well, how great is that? These kids are doing so well, even with all the headwinds built in, and the fear that if they bring their parents to a teacher conference, they might be arrested, and that's because it happens. It does happen. So I'd be glad to go on, but DAPA never made it. It was struck down by the same judge who eventually has decided to strike down DACA. So if we flash forward, the Biden administration comes in. DACA is up in the air because it has this decision. By the way, my book came out on a Thursday, and the Supreme Court, it came out on a Sunday, and the Supreme Court acted on Thursday. So I was in a race with them. I've been working on a book for about 10 years, and it accumulated experiences all the way back to my graduate student days in the 70s. So so it was a long haul, and I even became president at the University of Houston downtown. I had about 600 Dreamers there, and that was when DACA was struck down. And I remember going back to my office. I brought in some of my students and who are now immigration lawyers and some of the clinic folks to talk about this. And we had kids hanging from the rafters. We technically had 600, but we had about 1,000 people there and others watching on TV. And I left and I was getting in the elevator and I was in tears. Because I had no good news for these students. Mm-hmm. And it was clear that the bluff had been called. But this one student came up to me. He says, Presidente Olivas, llegamos tan cerca. We're so close. Mm-hmm. And he told me in Spanish to keep the faith. And I was completely crushed. Mm-hmm. I was emboldened on the one hand that this guy whose life had so many strikes against him, but he was doing so well. I looked him up later and he was doing honors classes. And I looked him up and made sure that he got all his scholarship money and had him come in and just have coffee with me to tell me about his life and so forth, because I learned so much from these students and their family. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, it was like his future had been taken away from him. Now, of course, the Biden administration wins, and they decide to continue with DACA, and Trump's administration had not ruled it out. So they started saying they're gearing up to allow more people to apply, because, of course, there are another 800,000 out there who never got a chance to apply, like your young brothers and sisters, or others who missed it, or didn't have the money at the time. I mean, there's any number of reasons why people couldn't do it. And so they're starting to gear up. And then an old case that had been set aside that was about the legality of the program. Now, the judge, to his credit, I'll give Judge Hainan, who's in Houston of all places. He was in Brownsville when he made the decision, but he had not pursued the case where he had already found that the program was illegal, because he was using the same theory that we used against Trump to say he can't undo it without due process. He's saying he never used due process at the beginning and announced it and went through. Well, that's not true, because he misunderstands the nature of discretionary prosecutorial discretion. Mm-hmm. And the Supreme Court could not have ruled for these students in the 5-4 decision that they had, couldn't have ruled for them unless it were a program that were legal. Mm-hmm. So I believe that the Supreme Court, while it didn't have the issue of the legality or the constitutionality of the program in front of it, mm-hmm. it simply assumed it. Mm-hmm. It could have said, well, this program can be struck down because prosecutorial discretion is illegal. Mm-hmm. Instead, they said you need more permission to do it. You need to use the Administrative Procedure Act to do it. You need to do it formally, as we've already talked about. I think that has as its presumption the existential, the belief, the built-in premise that this program is legal. Otherwise, the Supreme Court has approved an illegal program. They couldn't do that. That would be a nullity. So I think we could. The problem is it's in the Fifth Circuit now. It's been appealed to the Fifth Circuit. It's a very conservative circuit. Mm-hmm. And has only one Mexican American who's in retirement on it, even though the states are overwhelming. And also that jurisdiction also includes Louisiana and Mississippi, where there are not all that many Mexicans. There are quite a few documented people because they have ship yards in New Orleans, and they have chicken plucking facilities all over Mississippi. So they do have a number of both documented and undocumented students there. But the law, and then it will go to the Supreme Court. And it's hard to imagine that this current Supreme Court, because of the changes that have occurred since the last, even with last year's case, with 2 new members of the court, it's not clear to me that will happen. Now, here's the bonus, and here's where I don't want to leave your students without any hope, because what we have is hope. But President Biden wants to include immigration reform, including a form of the DREAM Act, that would give permanent residence to all documented and permanent resident and others who are eligible for permanent residence, would give them permanent residence, so you would have a pathway to citizenship. And if that is allowed to be in the Reconciliation Act, and they haven't made that decision yet because a parliamentarian has to act, so it's got a couple of contingencies, but I'm confident, again, because I studied to be a Catholic priest for 8 years, so I believe anybody can be saved, including Congress. And I believe it's going to be included, in which case it would be added to the highway bill. It would involve childcare. It would involve any number of other important issues. And it doesn't require a single Republican vote. It would require all the Democrat votes, but not a single Republican. So it could pass. And if that happens, it will be like a piece of Christmas. It would be like a Christmas tree with all these baubles on it, all of which are good, including tax reform and a variety of things. That is the best pathway right now. I don't see, otherwise, unless they change the filibuster rules, it will require 60 people, 60 senators to pass it. And the House, of course, the House has passed law for a DREAM Act, but it hasn't been adopted by the Senate yet.
Got you, Professor. So I want to ask you just a little bit about the history of the DREAM Act, okay, which obviously is one of the big topics here. So 2 questions I'm going to ask, and then I'm going to let you
Sure.
go deep. First of all, how was the litigation related to the in-state tuition related to the first DREAM Act? And secondly, do you consider the first DREAM Act to have been tried, let's say, in 2001? Is that what you believe?
Well, it was the first federal DREAM Act, and because it has to be federal law, whereas residency and the like is all state laws. That's a crazy quilt of 50 different state laws, plus Puerto Rico, plus Guam, et cetera. So, and they can have, and they're entitled to have different state laws, and they do. As I said, some states, the day you move there, just like, or when you become eligible to vote, which can be no longer than 90 days by federal statute, some of which is being undermined now. But in any event, there were, I think, 30 or so cases. I'd have to go look. And they're still going on. Some of these, I was an expert witness in 6 of them because I drafted 6 state requirements, and then they were all litigated at one point or another. And so I either wrote briefs or testified or was involved in those cases. But those were all in state court at state levels, because that, by elected judges, I might add, which made it harder, because they didn't want to be looking like they were giving away state resources. And so that built up, but by 2001, there was, that same year was the first year that Texas had a residency requirement. So I won't say that one led to the other. What led to the DREAM Act, which was introduced by Senator Kennedy, the famous liberal from Massachusetts, and Orrin Hatch, the famous conservative from Utah. I thought the fact that Yin and Yang proposed this was sufficient. In fact, I ended up paying at least 12 bets off, because I said, this has got to be law, because you got these 2 guys, if they're, and others were behind it. I mean, Senator McCain was behind it, and others were behind it. It just never got a hearing. And there was a time in 2008 when it did have a hearing, and it went for a vote. And by that time, Senator McCain was running for president, so he was off the table. I said president, I meant Senator McCain, who had been very active in immigration reform. He was, because he was from Arizona, and he was a a reasonable person. But when he ran for office, for president, he just couldn't. Senator Kennedy was having brain surgery. And there were a couple of others I out them all publicly, particularly Arlen Specter, who was a moderate Republican from Pennsylvania who later became a Democrat. He said his party left him. He didn't leave the party. But he said, well, if we do a DREAM Act, it's going to do away with the possibility of comprehensive immigration reform, which we haven't had since 1986. Mm-hmm. Well, that's nonsense. It's just the opposite. And so the Bush administration bailed on this issue and bailed on Dreamers, which surprised me because President Bush had been very much for immigration reform, at least until 9/11, and then he got caught up in national security and got us into this long war, et cetera, et cetera. So he was off the table. But I think if the DREAM Act had been enacted, it would have been the low-hanging fruit, because 90% of the people polled say Dreamers ought to have a pathway to citizenship. Right. They all speak English, and we've already invested in them, right, and we want to keep them. In fact, we spend lots of immigration attorney time. Not that that's a problem. Let me just say, to bring them here after if they're from India and they've studied here, and then they want to have practical training. Mm-hmm. And then they got an H-1B for them, and then they work for a while, and or they marry or whatever, and they become citizens. We spend a lot of time and money on that. There's clear pathways for it. Mm-hmm. Why not just convert all of these Dreamers the same way? That would have made it possible for immigration reform, in my view. If you could do it and show that it works. And by the way, I think that not only has DACA paid for itself, but it has provided us with this enormous workforce that is now lawyers, doctors, teachers, in particular, healthcare workers, etc. During the last litigation, a group put forward a brief, an amicus brief, a friend of the court brief, showing that there were over 200 doctors and nurses who had DACA who were working in the pandemic as essential care workers, without any pathway to citizenship, putting their lives at risk. And if you come up to these ranks, my guess is the DACA students in your class are very active in student organizations and solidarity groups and trying to help other immigrants come here and learn the ropes and so forth. And they're born for service. They know that not only did their parents sacrifice, but there's an entire regime, a community, a universe of people who have helped them. Even though they don't know them, they help people like them. And I would say, believe me, every law professor, including your own, is for this issue and has spent time doing that and trying to make things better and a pathway clearer. So, yes, 2001 was the first federal legislation. But it followed all these years of state legislation and litigation. And those two courts, of course, only intersect when there's a constitutional issue. And there were some. Mm-hmm. For example, there's a case called Toll versus Moreno in Maryland that said people who were here on non-immigrant visas could not get in-state tuition because they weren't allowed they had to maintain a domicile outside the country. Mm-hmm. And the Supreme Court said, no, that's not necessary. If they've been here for a long period of time, they can meet the durational requirements, and that doesn't require. Plus, they have the intention of coming here as soon as legally possible for them to do so. And so it actually upheld non-immigrants getting in-state tuition. That was the first Supreme Court case on that subject, although there'd been some back in the 1800s about someone moving from Ohio to Texas or something like that. But with regard to immigration, that was the first case, and it occurred within months. And it was the same people on the Supreme Court as the Plyler case. And so here you start having these important cases. There's also some benefits cases about who has residence for purposes of Social Security or for other kinds of things. And those were all getting whittled away. And immigrants were winning a lot of those cases. Again, there was a built-up expertise that was beginning to show itself in the benefits area that had not been there before because there'd been no cases and no one had ever thought of no state had ever made it illegal to teach or made it legal to charge tuition for undocumented kids. And it turns out, of course, that there are two things about that case that I think are important to point out. One is that education is a highway, and sometimes you're closer to home and sometimes you're closer to your destination, but going from K-12 to college is a smooth pathway that we try and have for all of our students, not just documented students and immigrant students, but for all our students. So if you are a parent and you really push your kids to do well in high school, it's because you want them to go to college and do well. Now, I'm not saying you can't go into voc ed or other kinds of programs. You can make excellent living becoming a carpenter or other kinds of things that don't require an English degree, like I had. But at the same time, the other issue is that Tyler made the parents into demons. It demonized parents because the theory was, here are these innocent children brought here, you mentioned earlier, not on their own volition, but of their parents. Well, yeah, what happens though is that when DACA comes about, you want to legalize them, they're the bad guys. Who wants to legalize the lawbreakers? It's one thing to say, well, the 3-year-old that we brought over, or we came over on a picnic and stayed 20 years. You don't blame the kids because their domicile is that of the parents, unless they emancipate themselves. It also means, though, if the parents are removed and the kids are minors, they go with them.
They go with them.
Yeah. So it's as wonderful as Tyler is, and believe me, I spent my whole life writing about it and being enthusiastic and then reaping the benefits for my clients on it. It does have a tone that has demonized undocumented parents. And that's why I think there hasn't been any comprehensive immigration reform effort that's gone any further than that. If the DREAM Act can't make it, comprehensive immigration reform sure is not going to make it.
Right, absolutely. Because as you said previously, polling shows, even in red states, that people think that dreamers should have a path to residency. And I want to ask you one quick question, and then I want to actually ask you to get out your crystal ball and speculate. I want to ask you some questions about what a DREAM Act that passes will look like. But before we do that, do you think, first of all, Professor Olivas, in your experience, just anecdotally, do you think most Americans don't know that DACA on itself, by itself, does not create a path to residency for the holders?
I don't believe they do. Those who know it, those who know what DACA is, know its consequences.
Okay.
I don't think that there's enough informed citizens in the U.S. and the polity. They're for it when the question is asked to them, if someone here doing well in school has not committed a crime and was brought here as a child, depending on how you ask the question, they're not lawbreakers, even if they don't have status. So some of it is polling, but I don't think that that's the fatal flaw. I think the fatal flaw is that President Trump ran on an anti-Mexican, anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant, even though, of course, he married two immigrants, one of whom's status, by the way, was hinky.
Melania Trump, yep.
But in any event, so that just goes to show that immigrants will do the work that U.S. citizens won't do.
Yeah, I've heard that.
Very Trump. Yeah. And I forget what your second question was.
Okay, so the second thing is, and feel free, you don't have to answer this if you don't want to. So we've been referring in this conversation as the DREAM Act. As a practical matter, they're actually separate bills. It's not one bill that's gone all the way through. And the language has changed, been tweaked from bill to bill regarding who qualifies, what are exclusionary factors, et cetera, et cetera. One thing that my students, and in fact also other dreamers that watch my YouTube channel, Dreamer TV, are always interested in, is what will a DREAM Act that actually passes and is implemented into law look like? And so I want to ask you, if you feel comfortable, Professor, I want to ask you age requirement, what you think it will look like, if there will be an educational or work or military requirement, what exclusionary elements there will be with regards to convictions, and whether you think an expungement will take a quote unquote, take a conviction off for the purposes of a DREAM Act. So basically just a little bit about the specifics of, in your mind, what do you think is going to be the Frankenstein combination that actually passes? Okay.
Right. Well,
so,
I'm going to look into my crystal ball.
Perfect. Get out the crystal ball.
I actually have one. Yes.
Wonderful. So the first question, the first part I'd like to ask, okay, so DREAM Acts, recently have basically proposed a path for those who came before they were 18. DACA, as you know, is only for those who came under 16. So you have to have been 15 or older. So my first question is going to be, a DREAM Act that passes, what do you think the age requirement is going to be?
Well, I think that it's going to be sort of the reverse. I think that anybody who's eligible for DACA is now considered by the polity to be eligible for relief. That's the relief that we're trying to cure. So I would guess at least eligible for DACA. If you have DACA or you're otherwise eligible for it and you haven't been able to get it because it was shut down, so that would include the no serious misdemeanors. That would include the no material felonies, things like that. And I don't know. I'm not quite sure how expungement would work in that regard. My guess is there would, if it turned out that it wasn't precluded, as opposed, it would never be, say, including expungements. It'll just be silent. In which case, then immigration law and expungement law takes over, which means that if you do it timely in the same jurisdiction and you've paid off all the fines and you've completed whatever terms were attached to that, that it is expunged from your record and therefore it doesn't matter anymore after that. My guess is those same expungement rules would work, but I can't. Those kinds of devils or in the details would have to be worked out. But that was how IRCA worked out. I mean, Immigration Reform and Control Act, if people had expunged records, they were allowed to apply.
Right.
Now that was, of course, that famous liberal, as you know, President Reagan, who enacted that. And so he had a bit more running room. But I think the same kinds of path, if the law is silent on something, then the holes will be filled in by immigration law or by other collateral laws that have bearing on it. Like they might say, if it were a driver's license offense, that might be off the that wouldn't be an issue. Even though a lot of young drivers have gotten caught when they have done something, it's usually because they're driving without a license, because in their states they're not allowed to get driver's licenses. So it becomes kind of circular. Now most states allow you to get one, and I think it's a public health, public safety reason to allow them, because then they have to have insurance, et cetera, et cetera. And you can track them better. I mean, if you're talking about, hiding out, having a driver's license, it's got to be current, is a way to keep track of people. And I think we're more used to that. These kids, this was my first complaint, was that they're going to have all this biometric information on these kids, and you're giving it up, and it wasn't. And the original DACA said it would be discretionary. It was that it might be available, but turned out, of course, that once it was enacted, everybody got employment authorization. Before that, you didn't. That was always discretionary, and sometimes they would say no. And so my guess is that if you're eligible for DACA and you stay in DACA status, so all that includes, including the age, including any border crossing since that time, any of the other loose ends that you're mentioning, or ones that, or like you don't do well enough to stay in school, you're dismissed from school, so you're on probation with college. My guess is if you can get back in college, that would probably cure that. So at the time you present to yourself, you've got to have used all the cleansers, out there that are available to get you DACA ready, is what that will look like. I don't want to start putting on the record what I think it is, because if I miss something,
fair enough,
they're going to say, well, Olivas is this old birthright citizen. By the way, I was on a phone call one time with some DACA students I was working with, and they wanted to go storm Senator Cruz's office, I think it was, maybe Cornyn. They both, not that they don't deserve being stormed, but I said, if you do that, you're going to get arrested and you're going to lose DACA, and I won't be able to bail you out at 2 a.m. when you call me, and I know I'm going to be your call because I've been called at 2 a.m.
Right.
So this one guy who was sort of a necio, sort of a snarky guy, he says, "Yeah, but you're just an old birthright citizen." I thought, everybody, there was this kind of sharp intake of breath. There were about 6 people. It was a Zoom, and I could just see them all going. And they all piled on him, to defend this old guy. Hey, Professor Olivas is our friend. He's bailed me out more than once, and if he says it, that's probably good enough. And he said, "Yeah." I said, "By the way, yeah, I am a birthright citizen, but I was born outside the United States, and I'm not sure that my standing is a question. The question is whether or not you'll be tossed out. I'm safe."
Right.
And so he later sent me a note and said, "Well, I just got caught up in the moment, and what an insult that I'm an old birthright citizen."
Yeah, exactly.
I've never felt so dissed.
That's funny. So one quick thing that you might be interested to know. So HR 6, regarding the expungements that you mentioned, HR 6, which was the Dream and Promise Act of 2019, which passed the House then, but then stalled out after that.
Right.
It was a 53 page bill. I read it line by line, and it actually did have provision whereby for non-significant misdemeanors, an expungement would make it not count for the purposes of
yes.
And that kind of, go ahead.
But another bill has passed the House, but it's not at all clear what will be attached to this reconciliation bill.
Right.
So I don't want, and that's why I said is expungement and some of these other details have been in the earlier one. Mm-hmm. I actually think that's too much detail because there are immigration provisions to take care of expungements. So putting it in law sort of narrows it and focuses it in a way that brings more attention to an issue that's truly a non-issue otherwise, because it didn't give any fresh expungement. All it said was if it's been expunged, then you're safe. And by the way, they did not mean if you've been in for manslaughter and you served your time and paid your thing back and made contrition to the court. That's not going to be expunged. Right. So I thought that was too much information when it's not necessary.
Right.
I want to keep the bill as narrow and focused as possible so it won't draw anyone's attention to, like, all of a sudden they're going to start getting all these. I could just see some guy from rural Georgia or Marjorie Taylor Greene get up and say, well, this is going to, we got to expunge all these criminals.
Right.
Why give them ammunition?
Right. No, I totally understand that. Professor, I said I would have you for an hour. We're way over that. So I'm going to wrap it up with a couple things. First off, we're going to do our lightning round of questions. And then I'm going to ask Professor Olivas' advice for those who are interested in either immigration advocacy or law school. And you did give a little bit of advice, but I want to give you the last word on that. So lightning round. First of all, dogs or cats?
Cats.
Okay. Coffee or tea?
Coffee.
Netflix or cinema? Let's say pre-pandemic cinema.
Amazon Prime.
Amazon Prime. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or
streaming.
Or Netflix.
Or Netflix. Croissant or bagel?
Bagel with a schmear.
Okay. Favorite country to visit?
Oh, United States.
Let's say besides, is there another one besides the United States?
Actually, yes. Singapore. Singapore, the one time I went there back in 1981, was the most spectacularly beautiful country I'd ever been to. I'd love to go back there. If it's one that I've never been to, it would be Australia. Singapore has grown, and it's got many flaws, but boy, beauty, spectacular beauty is not one of them. It is beautiful.
Okay. Favorite movie?
Either Roma or Godfather 2.
I watched Godfather 2 last night, not for the first time.
Every Christmas I watch all three. I cry about number 3 because it could have been so great. But
Yeah.
well, I consider it all one movie. Yeah.
Okay. And then finally for the lightning round, iPhone or Android?
iPhone.
iPhone all the way. Okay, wonderful. Last question, Professor Olivas. What do you recommend somebody do? They're watching this class, they're sitting in this class, they're interested in law school, maybe for immigration, maybe otherwise. What should that person do? And then how about this another profile of a person sitting here? They know they want to get involved in immigration, but they're not sure whether they want to go to law school to do that or not.
Both of those are fair questions, and I've spent a lot of my professional life answering those. Any lawyer, as your professor will tell you, the best lawyers read carefully, they read broadly, they ask why not, and they have deep knowledge in whatever area of practice. So if you're a family lawyer, you understand domestic law, divorce, child custody, things like that. In immigration, you understand the things you and I have been talking about that are very deep and involved and involve areas outside. So a willingness to learn, a focus, a sense that you're doing it not to become wealthy, but because it enables you to help others and give back to the country that you've made your own, to do well in school, to stay out of bad trouble. If you can get involved in good trouble, fine. Just don't go storm some senator's office and get deported, because then there's no expungement there. You can be in Jalisco and not be able to come back. Law school has become more competitive because people now, especially after the Trump administration, enrollments are back up very, very high, and it's an expensive proposition. I do urge it, even if you're sort of like me, where you weren't sure how you would use it. I wanted to become a better scholar. It never occurred to me I could become a law professor, and it's very hard, but there's lots of ways to do it. You can do it part-time by studying part-time and working full-time. You can, if you do well enough, you'll probably find some scholarship support. If you go to an in-state college, law school, you'll probably get lower tuition. Borrow money, invest in yourself, but do so without living beyond your means. I managed to get all my way through a PhD with only $400 in debt, and then I went to Georgetown and ended up $25,000 in debt in 1980. That was a lot of money, but I paid it off because it was an investment in myself. And if I wasn't willing to do that myself, and I also lived like a church mouse. I mean, I lived on, before there was ramen, it was mostly yogurt for me. And I used to sell plasma because I could do it every 4 weeks instead of selling blood, which took 6 weeks because they would put the platelets back in me, and so it was healthier. I don't recommend that, by the way, but you got to pay your bills and take roommates, but take serious ones, not just guys who've got better access to cannabis. Be serious about your studies, because I don't want you entering the law profession if you're not serious about it. But if you are serious, I think immigrants have made some of the very best lawyers I've seen because they've lived. And that doesn't mean by the way, you only practice immigration law. Some of my students were immigrants, and they practice intellectual property or all the fields of law because they're all out there and available to you. I would also say, do take the LSAT seriously. The fact that I lucked out was probably because I was a young birthright citizen. I just happened to be good at taking those tests. I had taken the GRE, and there are a lot of law schools that have not placed as much emphasis on it. But I think at the end of the day, they certainly make their financial aid decisions on the basis of how well you present yourself.
Absolutely do. They do.
Yeah. And you got to take, because these things are cumulative, you've got to take your undergraduate studies seriously. I wouldn't say that you have to be a political science major. In fact, I've always found that the two fields that I have found the best students, my own best students, were that they're either journalists or English majors, because they write. And something every lawyer has to do is write well. unless you're a Trump lawyer, in which case writing poorly, you lose cases. I think that it's a noble profession, but it's not the only way. You can work for immigrant organizations. You can participate by donating your services and your time to organizations that help immigrants and others. I would also realize, especially if you have younger brothers and sisters, that I was just told this the other day by one of my younger brothers, who's now a very successful lawyer who's about to retire and is moving to Colombia. I've got a brother living in Ecuador, one in Mexico, and one moving to Colombia. Wow. Sort of returning to roots, although our roots weren't exactly in those particular places. But he said that even though he had screwed up in school and in life generally when he was young, he had models of success, and he met me. And I had always been a good student. I was the oldest. I was hijo mayor. I was the oldest of the 10 kids. And I was in the seminary, so I was always doing doing well. One time, I brought home a report card where my lowest grade was a 96, but it was in theology. My father said to me, "Well, mijo, I'm gonna translate from Spanish, but that was a good grade card, but your lowest grade should not be in theology if you want to be a priest." And my brothers witnessed that. They thought, man, if Michael's his lowest grade's a 96, number one, hard, but number two, it's not good enough for our dad. Now, my dad wasn't an immigrant, but he acted like he was an immigrant because it has immigrant mentality about working hard and doing well in school. That school was the transformative activity for kids, not cutting lawns or all the kinds of things we used to do to make money for comic books mostly. It was reading, and I always would carry around this book called Mythology by Edith Hamilton. I could tell you every Greek god, every Roman god. I could tell you who their children were. I was always with a book, and I'm confident that's what made it possible for me to become a successful academic. And now I've written 16 of my own books, and I got more in me. I'm just getting started. And the truth is that anything worthwhile is not going to come easily. I see these rock stars, these rappers who all of a sudden get a big hit, and everybody thinks, well, they're just fresh off the boat. But in fact, they've been dying for years with little gigs and setbacks and owners who didn't pay them. And if you focus and if you're fair with other people, for the most part, it will come back to you. And I think that working with immigrants is its own reward. And you can do so either as a lawyer, like your professor and I have done, or simply by doing well. And others will say, well, I've got a friend who's on the California Supreme Court. He was just named to another position. And he grew up in Matamoros, Mexico. He came to the United States when he was 14. He goes to Stanford. He goes to Yale and Harvard. And he's a Supreme Court justice in California, the highest rank you can get in the state. And this is his name is Dino Cuellar. And just yesterday, he was named head of the Carnegie Foundation for Peace. And he was born in Matamoros. He came to the country without speaking English. He grew up in the Imperial Valley of California, with almost all farm workers. And yet he achieved despite all those headwinds. And I will bet that every one of you documented students in this class have that Dino Cuellar gene, because it somehow when you cross the border, it's planted in you. And if you nurture it and you water it and you weed it and you keep it focused and you give it sunlight, you honor your parents who are not demons. They sacrificed a great deal for you. But the way that they want you to achieve is to be successful. And honestly, if you don't do that, then shame on you, because you've been given these opportunities. And so many people are working on your behalf. Don't give up. Have hope. I do believe this President Biden matter will resolve itself. If it doesn't, comprehensive immigration reform at some point is going to take root, and you guys will be first in line. So in the meantime, keep working, keep registering, keep helping others, and I would say the same, by the way, to people born in the United States. Do the same thing. Help others who don't have your advantages. we're all very proud of you, and I dedicated this book and my life to you, essentially. And I've never regretted it. I've never looked back.
Wonderful.
Thank you all very much.
Great message, Professor, and wonderful tips for law school. Professor, you're an asset to the immigration advocacy community and to the legal scholar community. Thank you very much. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. If anybody needs to ever drop me a note or something, Google me. There I am. Hide in plain sight.
Wonderful.
Thanks, Professor. Great to see you all.
Thank you.